This is Covering the Spread, part of the FanDuel Podcast Network.
It feels like the Kentucky Derby was just yesterday, but now the Preakness Stakes is already here. It is on Saturday at Pimlico. We're going to break down the Preakness for today by talking to Todd Schrupp of FanDuel TV, getting his read on the field, whether Mystik Dan can get another win on Saturday, and his favorite bets at FanDuel Racing for this year's Preakness Stakes. This is Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and FanDuel Research. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a managing editor of digital media for FanDuel Research, joined here as mentioned by Todd Schrupp. Check him out on Twitter at ToddTVG. You can find him over on FanDuel TV down at Pimlico for this week. So Todd, I appreciate the time. I know it's a busy week for you. How you doing today?
Jim, sorry about we don't have professional lighting. The Courtyard by Marriott has it's making me this red glow, but just know I'm not sunburnt. But I am just not a professional light person.
And it sounds like based on your forecast, you're probably not going to get a lot of sun this weekend either.
No, that's a great point. It's something that all handicappers have to really take into account. The weather is going to be fine Thursday and Friday at Pimlico, where they will have racing, and Friday's a big card with their highlight being the Black-Eyed Susan top 3-year-old fillies there, kind of like the Kentucky Oaks was back in Louisville just a couple of weeks ago. But Saturday is going to be completely different. It's going to cool off by about 12 degrees, the high about 68. And then the big thing is, how much rain are we going to get on Saturday? This could be a track that ultimately ends up muddy or sloppy. And if it does, it has to change your approach to this race.
Absolutely. We'll talk about what that means for your card later on. We'll talk about the Preakness. We'll talk Mystik Dan and much more here in just 1 second. But first, a reminder to make sure you're subscribed to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcast. We are here Monday through Friday talking the best bets over at FanDuel Sports, whatever it may be. We're going to talk some boxing for tomorrow. We got PGA thoughts here. We got EPL, NASCAR, Formula One, and of course, baseball, NFL coming up on Monday as well. Subscribe to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcast. And if you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star rating. Covering the Spread also up on the FanDuel YouTube page and FanDuel TV Plus. The second leg of horse racing's Big Three is here, and FanDuel is the best place to bet the Preakness Stakes because right now all customers get a no-sweat Preakness bet up to $20. That means you'll get $20 back if your win bet does not win. Bet the Preakness Stakes with America's #1 sportsbook. Just visit FanDuel today for your chance at a no-sweat Preakness bet up to $20. Must be 21 plus and in select states only. Offer valid on first Preakness win wager. Verified FanDuel Racing account required. Refund issued in non-withdrawable racing site credit that expires on 6/10/24. Restrictions apply. See terms at racing.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG in Colorado, DC, Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Tennessee, Virginia, and Vermont. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT STEP to 53342 in Arizona, 1-888-789-7777. Or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-522-4700. Visit chaosgamblinghelp.com in Kansas, 1-877-770-STOP in Louisiana. Visit MD Gambling Help at Oregon, Maryland, 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia, 1-800-522-4700 in Wyoming. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. Call 1-877-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY in New York. Now, Todd, we'll talk Preakness here in just a second, but each time we have a new guest on, I want to pick their brain on their process because everyone has a different process for betting. And the more we hear, the more we can pick up on, okay, I like this. Okay, I like this. And that's how I want to make my own personal process. So, Todd, what steps do you take to research before you place a wager on horse betting?
Being a horse player and being a sports bettor overall is a continuing education. I'm still learning things to this day, and I've been in horse racing for over 35 years. Mm-hmm. There is a methodology that every horse player has, and it's the same thing with sports betting. Everybody can look at the same game and see it a different way. They can look at the statistics and the data, and they can view it in a much different way. And that's why you get wild swings and odds, and that's why you find value. And for me, I believe that really any endeavor in sports betting, and especially in horse racing, it's, if you had to divide it, it's 20% handicapping. It's 20% trying to find a winner. It's 80% of how you play that particular horse that you like, or that particular team that you like. To me, it always comes down to betting and the structure of your bets. So I have, over the years, kind of defined myself this way. There's two types of wagers in horse racing. There's vertical wagers. That means win, play, show, or finding the top 2 finishers, the exacta, or finding the top 3 finishers, the trifecta, or finding the top 4 finishers, the superfecta, or even finding the top 5 finishers, super high 5, when you can play. That's all vertical, down the tote board from first down to 5th. Then there's horizontal. That, to me, is defined as daily doubles, pick 3s, pick 4s, pick 5s, picking 2 winners in a row, picking 3 winners in a row, picking 4 winners in a row, picking 5 winners in a row. I have just come to realize I am a horizontal player, and I've stayed that way for many, many years. So whatever your approach is to the game, to me, it's more about how you bet, and you have to be consistent in what you do. So I consistently play in the horizontal pools, and that's how I've come to define myself. As far as how I would approach an individual race, on a daily basis, I like to look at the conditions of the race. What kind of race is it? Is it a claiming race where the horses can be claimed or purchased? Is it an allowance race, which is a higher level race? Or is it a graded stakes race like we're dealing with here? I would say my methodology changes based on what kind of race it is. So for the Preakness, to me, it's a visual process. I've been watching these horses since they were 2 years old. They're all 3 now. They're starting to develop. They're starting to mature. And that's why I would not define myself as someone, when you look at the Kentucky Derby, when you look at the Preakness, when you even look at the Belmont Stakes, the 3 races in the Triple Crown, I would not define myself as a figure handicapper. Looking at buyer's speed figures, the higher the number, the faster the horse. Looking at Ragozin sheets, the lower the number, the faster the horse. And the reason why I don't believe in figures when it comes to 3-year-olds this time of year is because they're changing so dramatically. And so you can't trust the figures race to race. For example, Fierceness overwhelmingly was the fastest horse in the field going to the Kentucky Derby, but he was nowhere in any of my plays because I could not rely on him to come back to the number that he ran in the Florida Derby. I like to visually watch how horses are running during the season and see a horse that is improving and maybe coming up to the big race, because these horses, just physically in the age that they're at, they're changing dramatically race to race. You can't always count on the numbers that they've run previously or even the past performances that they've run previously.
And it's also training schedules, because a lot of those races, they're not going to care about as much as they care about the Derby or the Preakness and stuff like that. And that matters a lot as well. Now, I want to ask you, because when you're betting horizontally, you're betting a lot of fields. So do you feel like your exposure to horse racing, where you are constantly paying attention, better enables you to be that kind of bettor where you can have a grasp on, different fields at the same track on a given day?
Yeah, look, it's not for the faint of heart being a horizontal player. Even myself, I can't tell you how many times I've gone home from the racetrack and I'm muttering to myself how I structured that wrong, or I could have had that
every day, Todd. It's every day.
Exactly. And that explains why my hair looks the way it does.
Right. That's why I have none. Exactly.
I mean, when you're trying to pick 5 winners in a row, think about think about a sports parlay. Think about a same game parlay. Just how many times, if the ball had bounced a different way, you would have hit that, or if you had gone on the side that you were thinking originally, you might hit that. Horse players have the same thing. Essentially, what horizontal playing is a same game parlay. It's a multiple team parlay. It's a multiple game parlay. So when you're trying to pick 5 winners in a row, what's difficult about it is pretty obvious. You could be brilliant for 4 races, and then it's that one race that knocks you out. So I agree with you. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for someone who's just getting into horse racing. I think you need to build on what you play when you go to the racetrack. Don't take it all on. There's a multitude of wagers you can play. You have to always be disciplined. You always have to be responsible. You have to play within your budget. And I believe, as a horizontal player, if you're just getting started out in horse racing, start with a daily double. Try and pick 2 winners in a row, and then kind of understand where you can find your value within that pool. Once you get comfortable with the daily double, move on to a pick 3. Then after a pick 3, pick 4, pick 5. And then, yes, there is even a pick 6, which represents kind of our lottery in horse racing. It can have a very healthy return. But you're absolutely right. you shouldn't just go from 0 to I'm a pick 5 player
Right.
now. You have to learn that along the way and see the ups and downs and how to build tickets, because building a ticket for a pick 5 is vastly different than building a ticket for a daily double.
And I think finding your groove, finding your strength is universal for sports betting, not just for horse racing as well. So let's talk here about Pimlico specifically, where they'll be this week, because every track is unique. So Todd, what should people know about Pimlico as they're researching this field?
Well, there's a reputation for Pimlico that they have tight turns and this idea that post position matters. Well, one, that's kind of been dispelled over the years. It really isn't a tight turn racetrack. It is a very different type of surface than what these horses have faced, especially if it becomes muddy and it becomes sloppy. So there's some horses who will come into the race in great form, but they just don't take to the main track at Pimlico. Predicting who's going to take to it, well, that's, there's nothing you can really point towards. You just got to hope that your horse, especially if they've been here early and they've been training over the track, if they look good in that regard, then you can assume they're probably going to be fine on race day. But that's more of a guessing game. You just hope that your horse takes to it. But I think you have to dispel this belief over the years that it's really tight turns at Pimlico. It's not true. And then this year, it's not going to really matter. If we had a field of 12 in the Preakness, the reason why the idea of tight turns would matter, post position would matter. We don't have that now. With Muth scratching, we've now got a field of 8. Post position is not going to be any type of concern this year. But I would just say to those who have heard it before that Pimlico has tight turns, it's not true. And I don't think it's ever really played a factor in the outcome, at least in the modern era and the time that I've been covering the Preakness. Now,
you mentioned the Muth scratch, and Muth was going to be the morning line favorite for this race. And that brings the field down to 8 horses, which I think that changes things a lot. Like I model NASCAR, and field size there matters a lot. So obviously it matters for horse racing too. How do you alter your approach when it's a smaller field of 8 horses versus a larger one like we saw at the Derby?
Well, the whole pace factor to me changes. When you have, say, like in the Kentucky Derby, a 20-horse field, you have those horses who are setting the pace. They get pretty far out in front of the last place finisher. From first to last in the first quarter mile of the Kentucky Derby might be 15 lengths. But in a field of 8 going any distance, it's more of a compact field. To me, in smaller fields, it's harder for horses to go gate to wire because first to last is a much, much shorter margin. Everyone is essentially in the race, no matter what the early pace is, whether it's fast, whether it's slow. So I do think you have to adjust with this smaller field in that regard. Me personally will never know now. I was hoping that Muth could remain in the field. Unfortunately, as a fever, which is a minor setback, we'll see him later in the year. But I wanted him as a heavy favorite because I thought he was very vulnerable in this race. And, putting aside what I thought about his qualifications as the favorite coming in, to me, it was the depth of the field. This Preakness is a deeper field than maybe the last 20 years that we've seen. So Muth would have had to have run a big race to win anyway. We are still left with a deep field, even with the favorite out. What's going to change dramatically are the prices that I was hoping to get on these other horses that I thought could beat Muth. They're gonna be knocked down in half.
Yeah, so that's the one bummer here is we're not going to get as long of odds. You have to take into account too. Like a number may not look super enticing, but it's in large part because it is a smaller field there. Mystik Dan is in the field for this week. Tight turnaround from the Derby, though. So that's kind of tough there. Mystik Dan originally 5-2 on the morning line. What's your view of Mystik Dan relative to this newly shaped field?
Well, here's a situation where I quote unquote knew too much or overthought it. So it's Derby day, and we had the same thing that we're going to have this Saturday at Pimlico, and that is the weather. How is the weather going to be? So it had been raining that morning and the night before, and then Churchill Downs did a great job getting that track to fast by the time we got to the Derby. It's a long day. I think it was about 6:47 local time when the Derby went off. This Saturday will be 7:01 Eastern time when the Preakness goes off. So even if you have rain at the beginning of the day is around 11 a.m. So you've got a lot of time for that track to dry out. So I was looking at Mystik Dan as a horse who was going to be so much better over an off racetrack. And once the track dried out, then I downgraded his chances. And that was a complete mistake. So he went off at a very healthy 18-1. As the saying goes, if you didn't go to the wedding, why go to the funeral? So I missed Mystik Dan at 18-1. For me personally, it'd be hard for me to come back on him at a shorter price. He's a deserved deserving favorite. Look, the horse that wins the Kentucky Derby and comes back in the Preakness is usually the stronger horse. They're turning back in distance. This is a shorter race than the Kentucky Derby. He has a lot going for him. If it rains on Saturday, he's got even more going for him. But for me personally, what he doesn't have going for him is I missed him at 18-1. So I don't know why I would want to take him at 8-5. But deserving favorite, anyone who wants to make a case for him, I have no problem with that. Regarding the turnaround, his trainer, Ken McPeak, took Swiss Skydiver, who had run in the Kentucky Oaks, took a filly against the boys back in 2020 and ran a huge race in the Preakness. And so this trainer in particular for Mystik Dan, Ken McPeak, he knows his way around. He's been around a long time. He knows how to get this horse ready. He said in the run-up, the key to a good thoroughbred racehorse, and we all know this, is how they eat after a race. I obviously eat very good. I make a very good thoroughbred racehorse. But he said this horse ate up his feet after the Kentucky Derby, and the 2 weeks since, he thinks he's gotten stronger. And that's the key, because there are some horses in that 2 weeks that I've seen on the Triple Crown Trail who had tremendous ability. They lost weight from the Kentucky Derby to the Preakness. That's not a good sign. Here's a horse that's putting on weight. He's eating well. I mean, there's really not a lot against Mystik Dan as far as his credentials. To me, it's just he's not going to be the price that I'd want.
Okay, so Mystik Dan 5-2 on the morning line here for the Preakness, and Todd not buying at that number. You said, though, that you had interest in some other horses. Think this is a deep field before Muth got scratched. And obviously, the price will not be as good, but they can still be values if we think that Mystik Dan may be a bit overvalued in this field. So, Todd, if I give you one Preakness bet, which horse are you targeting for this week?
Okay, so I've been going back and forth. I felt all along that the best route to the Kentucky Derby, the best 3-year-olds, were down in Louisiana. I loved that whole series of races. What our audience needs to understand is horses qualify by points leading into the Kentucky Derby. And so regionally, there's a series of races with a lot of points that get bigger with each race, and that determines who gets in the Kentucky Derby. So we watch these races regionally. You have California, basically the Santa Anita races. You have Florida down at Gulfstream Park. You have New York with the Wood Memorial and a series of races there. You have down in Arkansas, the Arkansas Derby, but races prior to that, like the Rebel in the Southwest. Louisiana has their series of races, and the last two were phenomenal. The Risen Star prior to the Louisiana Derby. The Louisiana Derby was the big prize. But the Risen Star was won by Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone very easily could have won the Kentucky Derby if he didn't get in that bumping contest down the stretch with Forever Young. Sierra Leone is one of the best 3-year-olds, one of the most consistent 3-year-olds out there. So when he came through Louisiana and he beat the field the way he did in the Risen Star, it spoke volumes about the depth down there. Now, he was not there for the Louisiana Derby. That race was won by Catching Freedom. Tuscan Gold was third in that race. Catching Freedom came back out of the Louisiana Derby, finished fourth in the Kentucky Derby, and I loved his race in the Kentucky Derby. One other thing to keep in mind, we've been talking about they're shortening up from the Kentucky Derby to the Preakness. So that's from 1.25 miles to 1 3/16 miles. The Louisiana Derby is one of 2 prep races for the Kentucky Derby that are at 1 3/16 miles. The other is the UAE Derby in Maidan overseas. So to me, it's an advantage for those horses who already been 1 3/16 miles. So both Catching Freedom and Tuscan Gold have already been 1 3/16 miles. This is not going to be an issue for them. Some of these horses will be stretching out. Mystik Dan will be shortening up. But the 1 3/16 miles is the key. I love the race that Catching Freedom won in the Kentucky Derby. I love the race that he ran in winning the Louisiana Derby. While Tuscan Gold was third behind him in the Louisiana Derby, this is the visual process I'm talking about. If you go back and watch the replay, there was a moment just after the 8th pole. So they entered the top of the stretch, and Tuscan Gold was in tight quarters, and he was very uncomfortable. By the time he got out of that, he then rallied on for third. I'm not going to say that he would have beat Catching Freedom that day, but I think he had more to offer. That's the visual process I'm talking about in handicapping these races. The other part to it in handicapping is knowing the trainers and knowing the connections. The trainer at Tuscan Gold is Chad Brown. Chad Brown is one of the most purposeful trainers you will find out there. In other words, he thinks about the long range goal. And it's something you said one of the most insightful things earlier. And you said the training habits and the races they're pointing towards. So when we talk about leading the Kentucky Derby, sometimes they're sacrificing a race. They know their horse isn't going to be 100% in this race, but this is a stepping stone to get them 100% for the Kentucky Derby on a fitness level that we're talking about. So you're absolutely right. Purposeful, methodical, that's Chad Brown. There's no doubt in my mind that he knew Tuscan Gold was not ready for the Kentucky Derby, but he thought of him as a Preakness horse. He had entered him in the Peter Pan Stakes, which was last weekend at Aqueduct, and he scratched out of there. The reason that is significant is because the Peter Pan would have been an easier race. So he scratches out of an easier race to go in a tougher spot. That tells you that he believes in Tuscan Gold. The other part to this is the owner of Clarovich Stables, who owns Tuscan Gold, Bill Lawrence. He grew up in Baltimore. In fact, the house he grew up in was just blocks away from Pimlico. It was always a dream of his to win the Preakness, and he is one of the main clients for Chad Brown. They pulled it off a few years ago with cloud computing, but it's still a goal of theirs because Bill Lawrence loves this area. And so knowing that the owner grew up around here, knowing that the trainer thinks long range and will sacrifice going to a race like the Kentucky Derby, where most people can't even turn the opportunity down because the Preakness is more important to them. Knowing those things is something that I can know having been around a while. But it goes back to what you're saying. It's all about trainer intent, how they train the horse up to the race, the races they use to get there. And to me, it all points to Tuscan Gold. I know people will look on paper and go, well, he was third behind Catching Freedom in the Louisiana Derby. But I would ask everyone to go back, watch that race. He was a better third than it looked. And then also just take into account, this is what Chad Brown, this is what the owner want to do. They want to win the Preakness. You know, everybody wants to win the Kentucky Derby, but there's big races in horse racing. In some connections, they value races above others, even if it is a race like the Kentucky Derby.
All right. I love that because it's a combination of, watching the speed, identifying the races you want, and identifying where you can find horses who maybe been undervalued. And I'm a numbers guy, Todd. I love numbers, but there are always situations in which your eyes catch something that the numbers won't. And I think identifying those spots, you can find undervalued horses. Like that's speaking my language, man. So I love it. Tuscan Gold, 8-1 in the morning line. I think that is very intriguing and pretty excited to see how things go for them here. And you mentioned like the tells too about withdrawing from other races. I think that like they know this horse and they're picking their spot. That to me is super intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, there's something we always talk about, and that is Derby fever. You will get a year from now, and you'll look back at the horses that ran in the Kentucky Derby, and you go, why did they think that horse could win at a mile and a quarter? Why did they think he could win there? But you only get one shot. That's why I've always said it's the greatest accomplishment in sports, winning the Triple Crown. You only get one shot in your 3-year-old season, and then you've got to run these 3 races at varied distances, all within an 8-week period, something these horses have never done. And so you win the Triple Crown, you're special. Triple Crown is very different this year because it's going to end at Saratoga at a mile and a quarter instead of Belmont at a mile and a half. But if Mystik Dan pulls it off, all the more to him. He's as deserving as any previous Triple Crown winner. But yeah, picking your spots, having a good 3-year-old, and sometimes it's a hard decision. You only get that one shot at the Kentucky Derby, but you pass. It could pay off for the rest of the year.
All right. So Tuscan Gold, also potentially some interest in Catching Freedom as well. That's where Todd is turning on Saturday for the Preakness Stakes. That's what we got here for today, Todd. Todd, it was a pleasure to talk to you, pick your brain a bit, and get your thoughts on the Preakness. You can find Todd on Twitter at ToddTVG. Have a fantastic time out in Maryland this weekend. Enjoy, and good luck to you with the handicapping as well.
Jim, you're one of the most insightful voices in the world of sports wagering and sports overall. It's great to be able to talk to you, and I really appreciate you giving horse racing a platform in the larger sporting world. It's a fun time of year because we're all horse racing fans throughout the Triple Crown.
Todd, it's all selfish for me. I need to know who I'm betting on. Like that's my motivation. Like it's not some higher thing. I'm just selfish, man. Like I gotta be honest with you. I need it for myself.
Invited back. Yeah.
Alrighty, Todd. Talk to you later. Enjoy.
Take care.
Again, that is Todd Schrupp. Check him out on Twitter at ToddTVG, and check out all the coverage this weekend as well from Pimlico on FanDuel TV, as they are all out there. Whole crew out there for this weekend for the Preakness Stakes. That is all that we have here for today on Covering the Spread. Back with you once again tomorrow. As mentioned, we're going to talk about that Tyson Fury match. We're going to talk to Gabriel Santiago tomorrow to get his read on that match, favorite bets at FanDuel Sportsbook, and much more. To get that as it is posted, make sure you're subscribed to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcasts. Also find the show on the FanDuel YouTube page and FanDuel TV Plus. If you've got any questions for me, I am on Twitter at Jim Sonis. You can also find FanDuel Research on Twitter at FanDuel Research. Want to thank you all for tuning in for today. Good luck to you with your bets for the Preakness Stakes. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow to break down some boxing in the final week of the EPL season. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.